I brought a variety of pieces of broken rock back from Nevada. I think they're stone tools, except for these, which I think are flakes, bits of examples of material. And I find that as I look at them, there's sort of stylistic differences in how they're made, and I'm trying to understand that. So I'm going to explain an attempt to capture stylistic features quantitatively. So that'll be coming up next. Then we'll go through these. I want to start my discussion of stone tool flaking with the discussion of sculpture and what I understand as someone who has tried to make forms, and I'm going to give as my credential this ivory duck carving that I'm working on. It's going to be an eider duck. And I can tell you that when you're carving, you think in terms of stages, where you want to finish one stage before you go on to the next stage. And for something like this, I had to get a piece of ivory away from this chunk of chopped up, messy material that I had. I had to find a block that a part of it was big enough, and so I sawed it out. And then, pretty soon you're sawing the basic shapes. And then, you're sanding it in and filing it in and maybe carving it in a little bit and getting the shape. And then after that, you try to create the details and refine the details. And maybe later you polish it. But in sculpture, and I want to say it must have been, I want to propose that it was true also in the minds of people making stone tools, you had stages where you're removing the material from the core rock. You're making a big flake maybe, or maybe you're using the original rock and removing some flakes from it. But there are these stages that you're going to be thinking of, and I propose that they thought in terms of getting the initial piece that they're going to work with. Then they thought in terms of shaping that piece to the purpose that they had. Now that might leave you with something called a preform at that point, but I'm not going to try to talk about preforms. You get it, the basic shaping, and then you refine it, you detail it. So for stone tools, you are making flakes that remove the piece from the core, or just not using the original core. Then you're taking additional flakes off of the piece that you've got to shape it more carefully for your purpose, and then you're sharpening it essentially. And I believe that those stages are theoretical and that you can try to measure them. So for example, I'm going to use a stone tool here, which has a variety of different pieces of surface on it, some of which I think must have been the original cortex of the rock, or actually they were part of what was removed in the first place to create the block. And I want to call the original rock stage 0, and this stage, those flakes, I'll say the primary flakes, are the things that remove the material from the core. And then the secondary flakes are the ones like these that are coming in to shape it in a larger way. And you can see them. And then you see within them, you see these smaller ones that are, I'm going to call, so that you had primary flakes where they still have the basic shape and some outer core. Then you have the secondary flakes, which are, shaping the thing. And then you have the tertiary flakes, which are sharpening it. And that's an approximation to what's going on. And you can talk I want to try to talk in those terms. In particular, I want to make another approximation, which is that, these things are a bit subjective. I'm looking at it, I'm calling this a primary flake, this is secondary flake, these are tertiary flakes, and these are like edge details. I keep sneering when I say that because I don't want to count them just yet, because they're easy to confuse with U-swear. Those final serrations are, I'm leaving them out for now. Those little teeny things, the little pressure flakes along edges, I'm mentioning them, but to get back to the larger scale subject of primary flaking, secondary flaking, tertiary flaking, you can approximate that. You can't ask someone to look at a stone tool and figure out which is which. You can talk about the size of the tool. You can talk about how much of the tool's surface is covered by tool flakes of size greater than half the biggest diameter, less than half the diameter, and less than an eighth of the diameter. And it's easy, it's convenient to talk in octaves and halves of things, because it's easy to approximate. You just look at something and say, well, you know, I want to say about half the surface here, or maybe about a third of the surface here is primary flakes, it's just outer core and things that were removing the block from its original source. Then maybe about half of it, or more than half of it, is covered with these secondary flakes. Let's just say, don't need to come up with a number right here. And then, you know, maybe an eighth of the thing, or maybe a 16th of the thing, is actually tertiary flakes. It's not like it's got sharpened edges all the way around or anything like that. So I propose that we measure tools that way, and I will proceed to show you examples of how we can measure different things. I propose to use octaves instead of one's intuition as to what's secondary and what's tertiary. I'll define things by things that are bigger than half of it are going to be primary flakes. Things that are between that and an eighth of it are going to be in length, are going to be secondary flakes, and things that are less than an eighth of it, especially things concentrated along the edge like that, are going to be tertiary flakes. Something that's really made nicely is entirely secondary and tertiary flakes. Something that's made like a raw rock, it's got nothing on it. So there should be a spectrum of different things, and I find that I'm able to tease apart a little bit some of the different types of stone tools I brought back from Nevada by measuring them this way. I'll show you what I mean. Let me be as clear as I can about this measurement I'm using to describe types of flakes and proportion of flakes. So imagine you have a whole rock, and half of it's this long, and you have some flakes are on that order, and things that are that order or bigger we'll call type 1 flakes. Things that are less than half the thing we'll call type 2 flakes, and things that are less than an eighth of the overall length we'll call type 3 flakes. And so the size ranges then are for raw, untouched surface, so no size range associated to it. For type 1 flakes, they're in the range from 4 to 8, where 8 is the full length. Type 2 is in the range from 1 to 4, and type 3 is in the range from 0 to 1. I'm using octaves and eighths because it's easy to divide by 2 and look at things. So then you're curious about how much of the surface is each of these types of flake. The flake's dimensions are linear, the length of the flake, but we're going to look at how much of the surface is the original cortex, how much of it is type 1 flakes, how much of it is type 2 flakes, and how much is type 3 flakes. And then we have a vector which describes the flake proportions. Those numbers add up to 1, because all the different types of surface have to be represented, and each one is the percentage that is it. So those are exhaustive types. And if you want to express that vector of proportions in terms of numerators over 8, then you just use counting numbers here, or those plus fractions. And that's how you measure the flake proportions of the stone tool. So let me do a careful study of this example. Let's start with this. This surface, I think, is cortex, the original surface of the rock, and so is this. They don't look like they have flake on them. Continuing around, that does look like it was one flake. Continuing around, that does look like one flake, and we'll come back to this side of it later. And we're back to here. So I estimate maybe about an eighth of the overall surface is just this original cortex, and then this is the kind of flaking that was done to produce a blank of rock this size, sizing and blanking. This surface there, this surface here, and if you're going to count things that are bigger than half, maybe you want to count a little bit of this as what I call primary flakes, part of shaping, creating the block of material. So we'll say a quarter of the overall thing is that type of flake surface, and then you have these flakes, which don't appear on the ends there, but also appear over here. And they make up about half of the overall surface of the thing. 4/8. So we had 1/8, 2/8, and now we have 4/8. And then you've got sharpening along there and along there, comparable in proportion to the size of this. So we'll say another 1/8 for that. So we have 1/8 of the surface is cortex, 1/8 of it is primary flake, or 2/8 of it. 4/8 of it are secondary flake, and another final 1/8 of it is tertiary flake. So we got a 1/8, 2/8, 4/8, and 1/8. And I'll just write that down this way. So I hope that's clear. This is an example of an Oldowan pebble chopper that Wikipedia has up there. It's the oldest known type of stone tool. It's basically composed of a single rock from which a few flakes have been removed along one edge. If it could show you the other side, you might see that they're lined up or possibly alternating on the other side. But all the flakes are the same size. You can call them primary flakes or secondary flakes. I'll call them secondary flakes and say that this thing is 3/4 core, so 6 out of 8 core and 1 out of 8 secondary flakes, and nothing else. So as a measurement, we can go, what do we say, 6, 2, like that. And you can argue about where that goes. That's the oldest known type of stone tool. So now let me talk a little bit about this miraculous bit of flaking. This is something that you get the core prepared with flake scars on the core. You prepare the platform just right, if I can illuminate it, and then you hold the core against something hard and you whack it just right in such a way that amazingly you get a flake that's got the ridge of the previous flake scars right down its midline. And then that's it. Little pressure, maybe a little bit of pressure flaking here and there along the edge, but you're done. So in terms of this measurement, what's really interesting about this thing is that once you'd knocked the piece off, you were done. But they were preparing the core beforehand. It wasn't just a random flake that was knocked off. So the stone tool was made on the core, and then last thing was it was broken off. That's the old-fashioned way of doing things. So this has a very small amount of original core on it, but I'm going to ignore it at either end there. And I'm just going to say the whole thing is primary flake. There are no secondary flakes. There's no details. What an amazing measurement. And that's called a bladelet. You know, as illustrated on YouTube and the internet and the Google. So here's a different bladelet. And somehow I get a feeling that this was separated from the core and then worked on a little bit, because in fact there are a couple of secondary flakes right along there, things that are bigger than a quarter and less than a half of the orbital length, and also there's some edge work there. So in this case, this little bladelet here, this little bladelet went to market, and this little bladelet stayed home. You've got 0 7, 1, 0. A little bit different from the other one. And I think very clearly that if there was any such thing as a mathematics of these numeric patterns, these vectors, if you like, it would have to accommodate sliding something from here to here, because after all, the boundary is defined by a single threshold number, which you could have something right on the boundary and it might fall either way, and you ought to tolerate such changes so that this is not too far away from that, but it is quite a long way away from that. And what else we had? Going back, so these bladelets are quite interesting. But I think, separate from the use of this flake proportion analysis, the idea that you'd prepare the core and then whack the whole tool off when everything else was ready, it's an interesting idea. And marks, I think, the Middle Paleolithic, for what it's worth. Not that the same techniques couldn't have been applied at any other time as well. Let me continue the discussion of flake proportions and compare these two tools, or these two rocks. They are similar shaped, and you look at this one for a little while. It doesn't take long to realize that there's some edge work on here, a little bit there. But otherwise, it's mostly this surface and then this type of surface, which are primary flake, secondary flake, mostly. So you might want to say that it's all primary flake, secondary flake, and just a little teeny bit of edge like that. You could make 3.5, 3.5 if you liked. I'll look at this one, and you'll just notice that there's no worked edge. This edge has some damage along it. These teeth, broken off, rounded, stretch between them is kind of damaged. It's not true over here. So in this item, like this item, the working edge is along there. But to make some comments that are not flake proportion related, this one could have been held pretty easily like this. For a hand that's smaller than mine, I find myself trying to grip this with the tips of my fingers a little bit. Used. Try to do the same thing here, and the thumb doesn't end up in the right place. So you think maybe it should be held like this, or given that that's part of the working edge, maybe it should be held like this. So it's not held the same way. And you can look at whether this is cortex or primary flake. I think it's not really clear to me. Much of it's cortex and primary flake, sort of like the other one. It's ambiguous as to what's primary flake and what's cortex. But otherwise, it's mostly secondary flake and no tertiary flaking. So you might write it down as 0, 4, 4, 0, or in my horizontal pattern, 0, 4, 3, 1, and 0, 4, 4, 0. So these are similar. And you could get from this one to this one by moving a single one that way. Turns out that kind of similarity comparison is called the Wasserstein metric between probability measures, not the Euclidean metric, as I said earlier. Let's talk about this stone tool, which, as I said at the beginning, I find to be the most difficult to understand. I'll try to understand and study the flake proportions and use that to sort of support other things that I want to say about this piece of rock. But it remains somewhat confusing. But I want to say that there's several different things that are making me want to say that it looks really pretty old compared to most of the other things that I've got here. Old in the same way that this thing feels old, that I talked about earlier. And before I get on with the flake analysis, let's just take a look at it. You get this impression that these flake scars were on the core before this thing was knocked off. You see almost no secondary flaking, maybe just those two things right there, those two surfaces. Otherwise it's either major flakes or something that was on the core. You realize that this stuff, these rough surfaces, were actually, there's flaking having gone on there. So those are tertiary flakes. So a little teeny collection of tertiary flakes right along there. Maybe a little bit over here. And so you say, what is this thing? Is this a tool? It looks like a stemmed point of some sort, but that's not aerodynamic. It wouldn't fly through the air. Is it an edge? Sort of, kind of, sort of, maybe, but not really. So something that if used as a point at all is for stabbing. Now why do I think this might be old? Well, for one thing, I think it's fun if it would be old, so that's a bias. But I tell you, it's darker. It's a darker black than everything else. It's just been sitting on the surface a lot longer than everything else. And just this absence of secondary flaking makes me sort of curious about it. So now I think that the analysis of this stone tool, and I'm sorry I'm talking so much about it, is that you do see that the stem was probably used to hafted, and there's a bit of polish right there, so a stick would have been stuck right there, and then tied on, lashed on. So it's a bona fide point of some kind. But the question is this core text here, or is that primary flake? I ask that only in terms of the metric that I'm going to apply. Because if it's primary flake, this is all primary flake. It's got wee bits of secondary flake and wee bits of tertiary flake, and you get a measurement like this, divided between cortex and primary flake, and just a wee bit of the other two. Whereas if you assume that this surface here is there's some justification for thinking that that's primary flake. It somehow came out rough, even though there's traces of the bulb of percussion here. Well, if that's primary flake and this is primary flake, then the measurement comes out mostly primary flake and a little bit of secondary and tertiary flake before. So now what I want to say is that is in fact like the measurements for this, which were 0.800. And then if you look at this Wasserstein different distance between, well, this possible measurement for the stemmed tool, or this possible measurement for the stemmed tool, you're going to see that it really comes down to how you're interpreting that surface. But under one interpretation, you get something that's 6 units away from this. And under another interpretation of the measurement, you get something that's only 3 units away from that, because you can turn this into a column of 8s by moving this 1 and this 2 to get an 8 there. It's kind of an interesting observation that if I look at this version of the measurement versus this version of the measurement, they're 3 apart also. So these two are as close as these two, but these two, if I work it out, are 6 apart. So this measurement's more consistent with wanting it to be like that. And I understand that there's some circularity in what I'm saying, but you do get a sense that this is perhaps was prepared on the core rather carefully before being whacked off and then further sharpened in a limited way and used in a stemmed manner. And I wanted to say something conclusive about that. You go online and look for things that appear like this, and you find them in a collection of objects called Aterian points, which, what do you know, they turn out to be from the Middle Paleolithic, just like this. So a similar set of of stages of manufacture between these two. This is a little bit more refined than that, in that it's got a bit of secondary flaking and little attention spent to the tertiary flaking. So that's my best guess. Nothing conclusive, but the vectors and the distances measured in this Wasserstein manner are, I think, helpful to show the alternatives that way. Let me now do a final summary of what I brought back from Nevada. I'm going to comment a little bit more on this lovely thing, which is secondary flake and tertiary flake. So 0, 0, let's say 5, 3. So is this 0, 0, 5, 3. I'm going to comment on a few other things here and there, and then I'll try to summarize. First of all, I want to take a longer look at these three items really here, and just make some comments about them. They're obviously flaked stone tools. They may have a big chunk of primary flake on them. It's not worked much. They have polish down here. They have damaged edge all along here. So each of these three items has the same sort of idea, which I'm not trying to quantify with flake proportions here, but the idea is that you've got this part of it, and you've got that part of it, and the working edge goes all the way around there, all the way around there, all the way around there. So you start thinking, okay, now how would that be used or deployed or whatever? If that's going to be hitting the material, then this is either going to be in somebody's hand or it's got to be in the handle of some kind. And I can tell you, you do not want to be holding onto those sharp edges. So you wonder, why did they leave them there if they're not going to be working edges? I come to the conclusion that this was jammed down into the handle, probably held in place by pressure. And all three of these things have the same basic feel. And look at this one now, this magnificent piece. It's all, you might call that a primary flake, or you might call them secondary flakes. It's all secondary flaking, the whole thing. So it's 0, 0, 8, 0. And you might push a little bit of that over to 0, 1, 7, 0, instead of 0, 0, 8, 0. You can push some of it from secondary over into primary. But these are uniquely shaped. I call them short-stemmed axes. This is just a little tiny one. Sharp around here, not used, not damaged. Damaged around there, perhaps a little bit of tertiary flaking maybe. Essentially all secondary flake. So these are an intermediate type of flake proportion. I want to make a couple of specific comments about these things. I was noticing earlier this X pattern that you see on those two guys. Remember that we compared these two things, and there is no X pattern on this. It's a different way of thinking about how to break off the major pieces. And then I find of some interest that that X pattern appears on these smaller things. This is a Great Basin crescent whose date of 8,000 to 9,000 years ago is understood and known. So I think that you can make some comparisons between those and give the known date for that. You could associate that to things like this. Remember, this one's a little bit older because it doesn't have edge work. And this one is the same flake proportions as these two, so I put it into the same category as that. This is also something with a worked and sharpened and damaged edge along the upper curve. And all of this is sharp, unused. So almost all secondary flaking. So, but this has additional edge details that those may be lacking a little bit. And unlike the short stem here, this has got a longer stem, which sort of matches the sense that this is all stem here. So, different kinds of axes. and I'm going to say different style of flaking. Let's remember these bladelets. This was a 0800 and this is a 0710, no 0701. It's like you were doing a smart flaking off the core, and then you started just doing a little bit of additional detailing. So the tertiary flakes came in after the primary flakes, but before the secondary flakes. I don't know. Consensus that that's a little bit older than that. And that these are perhaps, who knows. There's a bunch of stuff I don't know what the heck this is. You can look at the flake proportions and try to assign them to one of the groups that you've got here. This group, this group. I regard this as having the same kind of flake proportions, except for the convenient bits of cortex on there. It's pretty much the same as that. And so you have a spectrum of these things. Before I go away from the specifics, let me just comment that this really didn't get flaked by someone who had a lot of strength, and I try to put my hand around it, it's way too small, and I just get a feeling of sadness when I look at that. The person didn't have, they just had to pick up a piece of scrap that other people had discarded maybe, used it for some kind of a braiding, maybe similar in use to that and these others, but there's this. Someone wasn't being taken care of by other people. Someone small on their own. Anyway, so finally, let's look at what we have in terms of a summary of these different things. So I'm going to start off very quickly with the bare rock. It's got all of its surface untouched by flakes. Got an old one pebble chopper and you start taking a few flakes off of it, so you get some primary flakes, or maybe you call them secondary flakes. They're about a quarter of the overall size of the thing, the overall dimension, pushing closer to half. So I think actually this is the correct thing to write down. You see a pattern here of crudeness replaced by some additional detailing. The old bladelet, my favorite, was a 080. Everything's primary flake. The other bladelets, those guys, had a little bit of secondary flaking on them. Where'd it go? I didn't. Yeah, a little bit of secondary. No, this is a mistake. It's just like that. Sorry. Where's my pen? Fix this one. The stabber, that funny stemmed point. It's got a little bit more stuff moved away from the primary flaking. The short stemmed axes there, they've got some cortex on them with primary flake. And then all the weight's on the secondary flake. The long stemmed axis, that guy is in the same pattern as those, which I think was 1331. Then you've got these sort of solutrium type things, which are secondary and tertiary flakes alone. This is in that style, but with some advantageous use of cortex and primary flaking. These are little things, I don't know what to make of them. They're arrowhead-like. Or these are called gravers. I'm going to have to go. This is getting too late. But what you see is that the oldest stone tool is just a rock. And the sharpest, neatest, most modernistic looking thing, the crescent, is all the weight's on primary flakes, really. There ain't even any secondary flakes to be seen here. It's just all small flakes, probably because of the size of the piece is similarly with that. So you have a spectrum where the weight seems to sort of move from here and diffuse outward. And sometimes they go from crudeness to a little bit of sharpening, and then the sort of intermediate shaping concept might have come along a little bit later. It's all very, very interesting. And if you were out in the desert, you wouldn't be spending time at home looking at these things. You'd be looking at the ground and having a great time